Hi, I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States.
And this is Gender, a Wider Lens, a podcast dedicated to the shifting concepts around gender in our contemporary culture.
Through in-depth interviews, personal stories, and psychological exploration, we seek to open up the discourse around this hot-button issue.
Join us as we look at gender from a wider lens.
Hey, Stella.
Hi, how's it going, Sasha? How are you?
Going well. It's going well. I am fine. And today we talked to Heather Hying, and it was an amazing conversation. Finally, we got Heather Hying on the show. She spoke in Denver, but we had not had her on yet.
I've always been a fan of Heather Hying, so I think I was a little bit starstruck in Denver. And her speech in Denver, her presentation was just phenomenal. It was really, really interesting. And I was like, God, somebody who speaks and you just think, I want to hear more. I just want to hear more of what this person has going on. And that's what we did in this podcast. We really explored all the things she's lifted, not only in that presentation, but in other parts of her work. Fascinating woman with a wealth of knowledge about what it is to be human.
Yeah.
If you follow me, it's completely different than us because it's not from a psychological level. It's from a completely different other kind of understanding.
Yeah. Well, she's an evolutionary biologist. She also spent many years teaching and taking students on these unbelievable trips into kind of the forests in South America and studying animals in the field. And she's also an amazing writer. And we talked about something very, very interesting to me, which has come up in a few other interviews, is how, this sounds almost strange to point out, but how important real life experiences are. Yeah. And this came up because she has taken kids on these amazing trips. And I think one time she describes a conversation with maybe another person at her university or another professor who said, well, why can't they just read about it in a book? And this sparked a fascinating conversation, which is just so crucial about how do experiences land on us when we are actually in the moment. We are doing the thing rather than trying to intellectually or cerebrally learn about a concept. So that was actually a very, very interesting part of the conversation.
And it's very instructive for an awful lot of people who are, let's say, living with people with gender issues, and a reminder of we can teach them, we can speak, we can read, we can watch. Actually living a different life, living out in a different culture is it's indescribably different. It's incomparable. There is no equivalent. And that's what it really came home to us with the Heather Hying interview. Heather has so much to offer the likes of me, who've always falls into psychology. And do you know what I mean? To remind ourselves that there's evolutionary, there's anthropology, there's instincts. There's, for example, the instinct, the disgust instinct, the fear instinct, how this helps us and it protects us and it shapes our behavior. We also, of course, I brought up the famous Phil Lilly and the man in the blue dress for anybody who's interested towards the end of the episode. I do discuss it because I think it's very important that we do highlight any of the issues that arise as we're managing this incredibly fast changing landscape. And there's an awful lot of controversies every couple of months, as far as I can see. The more that we just try and, when it's over, reflect on these things, I think it's very important.
Yeah. And, another thing that Heather talked about a little bit is her evolution on how she understands the question of trans. Because a couple of years back, she wrote this beautiful letter exchange with Abigail Schreier, where she talks about some students that she has who identified as trans. And she's actually changed her perspective a lot on this. So if you're curious about it, this would be a really great interview to listen to. So let me read her bio and then we'll just let you listen.
Brilliant.
Heather Hying is an evolutionary biologist who's conducted research on the evolution of social systems and sexual selection, from frogs to humans. She's a PhD in biology and a BA in anthropology, and has been a visiting fellow at Princeton University, and before that she was a tenured professor at the Evergreen State College. At Evergreen, she architectured a curriculum that prioritized the scientific method and exploration of both ecosystems and ideas. She has since been invited to speak about higher ed, the evolution of sex and consciousness, and the culture wars in venues as varied as the U.S. Department of Justice, the Krishnamurti Institute, Joe Rogan, and Oxford University. Her first book, Antipode, is based on her life in Madagascar while studying the sex lives of poison frogs. Her second book, co-authored with husband Brett Weinstein, is A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, Evolution and the Challenges of Modern Life. A New York Times bestseller, the book provides an evolutionary toolkit for living a good and honorable life as a modern ape. She also writes natural selections on Substack, the Field Notes column for County Highway, and co-hosts with Brett a popular weekly live stream on the Dark Horse podcast. Without further ado, here's our conversation with Heather Heying. We want to take a moment to thank our sponsors, GenSpect and Therapy First. GenSpect is an international organization committed to fostering a healthy approach to sex and gender. The team and members of GenSpect strive to promote high-quality, evidence-based care for gender nonconforming individuals. GenSpect is pleased to offer a non-medicalized approach to gender with their recently published Gender Framework, and they continue to hold conferences around the world. Visit genspect.org to learn more.
Therapy First is a non-profit worldwide professional association of mental health providers who view psychotherapy as the appropriate first-line treatment for gender dysphoria. Therapy First supports psychotherapists working with gender dysphoric youth and young adults and offers public education on mental health and psychotherapy. Visit therapyfirst.org to learn more.
Now back to the show. Hi, Stella, and welcome, Heather.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you. We wanted you for a long time, and now we finally got you.
Well, it was great to meet you in Denver in November, I guess, of last year.
Yeah.
And I hope that marked the beginning of a long relationship.
Yeah, I hope so as well. So, there are so many questions that I have about the kind of evolutionary biology angle around gender, and particularly around how hormonal and surgical interventions impact our experience as people who are trying to kind of make it through the world, make sense of sexuality. And just before we started, you mentioned that you were reading a really interesting paper this morning, an evolutionary biology paper that got you excited to kind of dive into the basics. So can you tell us what that paper was? It might lead to some interesting questions for our audience.
Sure. At some level, it was a test of a long-standing set of hypotheses in evolutionary biology, which the hypotheses are based on some work done in the 50s by a guy named Bateman, and then work done in the 70s by Bob Trivers, who was my first mentor in evolutionary biology. And so it emerges from first work on Drosophila, on fruit flies. And as soon as we start talking about other species, a lot of people in this space go, oh, but it's not relevant, it's not humans. And that's not quite right? In fact, it's not right at all. Like, the fact of, for instance, clownfish existing doesn't mean that humans are clownfish. But what is true in other species is obviously indicative of what is possible and what has happened in other evolutionary space. So in fruit flies, what Bateman found in the late 50s was that when you provide male fruit flies lots of opportunities to mate, their reproductive success, which is the evolutionary indicator of fitness, goes up. The more chances they have to mate, the more children and grand offspring they end up having. Whereas when you offer female fruit flies lots of opportunities to mate, after the first or second successful opportunity, their reproductive success doesn't really go up. Like they have pretty stable, females have pretty stable reproductive success.
Wow.
As long as they have a mate, they end up being, having kids, and those kids tend to have grandkids. And so the general conclusion that emerged from this, that this paper I was just reading this morning was testing, is this actually a general conclusion, was, that in general, females have lower variance in reproductive success, that most females, and again, we're talking across the animal kingdom, but this also applies to humans, will on average have 2 kids. Whereas the average for males is the same in a stable population, but the variance is way higher. There are a lot of males in any population that'll have 0 kids, 0 opportunities for mating, whereas those individuals who have lots and lots of opportunities, for whatever reason, however awesome they are in that species, whatever it is that they're doing to attract all this female attention, they may have a ton of kids. Whereas there's no female humans out there, for instance, with hundreds or thousands of children. It's not anatomically or physiologically possible, and it is possible for males. So this bit of insight, which was higher variation in reproductive success in males than in females, then fast forward 20 years or so, and we have Bob Trivers observing that, okay, you've got all this investment, and the terms in evolutionary biology and economics do overlap, and some people object to that, but it makes sense if you think about things in a resource sense. The ways that the moments that males in most species tend to invest in their reproduction is prezygotic, meaning before the mating happens. And the moments that females tend to invest in reproduction is postzygotic, meaning after the mating happens. And there are exceptions. And we could talk about the exceptions, but that, if all you have to do is sort of, flip the switch and go like, is that true in humans? Like, are men more likely to be on the make, trying to get into women's pants, trying to get the mating opportunities? And then are they more likely after they've succeeded to disappear? Yes. Right. Yes, that is true. And especially in mammals, we have mandated maternal care with gestation and lactation. And so females are much more likely to be choosy, much more likely to say, not so fast, buddy, because this could be in humans, an 18-year investment, a lifetime investment. It's not okay for me to just have this event and then walk away. And of course, birth control changes the logic, but we haven't had reliable birth control for very long. So a lot of the logic that our brains are based on is obviously from a pre-birth control era. So these two, Bateman and Trivers observed these two things, and a relatively new paper, it's from 2016, basically was looking across animalia, across animals, and saying, does this actually apply? And yes, it does tend to, with exceptions. With exceptions like seahorses and jacanas and phalaropes, which are shorebirds that are polyandrous, which have single females have multiple male mates. So the opposite. Usually when we think of polygamy, we think of one male with lots of female mates, right? Well, the opposite can happen. Polyandry can happen. And some shorebirds do this, but it's very, very rare, where you have males effectively taking care of the kids and the females going around and laying more eggs with more males and having them take care of the kids. But it's the exception. It's the very rare exception.
And I think, as far as I know, a lot of people take exception to you coming up, or me, or any of us saying things like this, because they think, and therefore we are forgiving of males who want to sow their wild oats. That's the immediate leap and the rush to suppress is I presume you face all the time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the way that, so Brett, my husband, and I wrote about in our book, In Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, and indeed we're teaching about for years when we were professors, was really given what mammalian anatomy and physiology restricts us to, and given that it mandates this maternal care, and it does not mandate paternal care, but there are very rare species of mammals that have monogamy, humans being one of them, we can say that actually call it what you want, sow and go, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. That strategy of males has never been an option for females until birth control. It was never an option. So really there was only one reproductive strategy available to females, which was be very choosy, be very careful. And then in a monogamous species, be so choosy that you've hopefully chosen someone who will stick around and help you with the raising of the children and be your partner for life, or at least for a while. Whereas there have always been more strategies for males. There are really three. Wow. That is one of them. And I would argue, I have argued that strategy that is the main strategy for females is the best strategy for males too. Not only for society, not only for women, and not only for children, but actually for the vast majority of men too. But of course, we know that men do have two alternate strategies available to them. One of them is universally understood to be horrifying. It's force, it's rape, right? And one of them is this, actually, I'm going to see if I can get you to have sex with me and then I'm going to leave. And that's the one that we have been, I still insist on thinking of myself as a feminist, even though it's sailed past me in so many ways. I used to refer to the third wave and beyond as faux feminists, but, the third wave feminists who basically said, hey, let's take that really awesome strategy of men where they don't have to invest at all and they don't have to care. And it's just like a string of one night stands. Let's get that for women because that's going to be equality. It's like, well, I guess it is equality, but that's not the equality we want. How about we inform people enough so that they are attracted to the idea of everyone acting like women at their best with regard to reproductive strategies, not with regard to all these other things about what makes men men and what makes women women.
Right. And
do not encourage women to act like men at their worst. Why would we do that? So we are absolutely not trying, neither you nor I, Stella, are trying to give cover to that strategy because, saying this happens, this is evolutionary is not saying it's good. We're not, I would say, the naturalistic fallacy is alive and well in people's minds where once you start talking about what is, they assume that you are assigning a moral, valence to it and saying, well, if it's happened, it must be good. And I would say, you know what? We can recognize that genocide happens and that rape happens and no one's going to argue those are good. But actually we are best able to understand them and to minimize their prevalence in society if we understand where their origins are and who is most likely to engage in them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
This also makes me think about the fact that, cultures also create norms and prescriptions against this kind of behavior, which can be detrimental to the family unit or the community unit. And so in addition to kind of recognizing that these are strategies that were perhaps evolved, we also see that, there's a term, for example, the deadbeat dad. We do not in society approve of this behavior. So you can acknowledge that it has evolutionary roots while at the same time recognizing that our cultures too have evolved to kind of address these tendencies and mold and shape people's behavior in a pro-social way that is better for everybody. And, this is something I'd love to ask you about because, certain types of feminist philosophy seem to assume that the differences in male and female roles, let's say, have been developed for the sole purpose of benefiting males. And I used to think that way, and I've come to feel very differently. But can you talk a little bit about the way we actually, any cultural prescriptions have technically had to evolve in some sort of way that facilitates like symbiosis between men and women? It of course doesn't always work out, but this is, I think, a misconception that a lot of people have if they adhere to certain kind of feminist beliefs. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I think, if a cultural tradition is longstanding and persistent and has some variation in it, then it is almost certainly an adaptation. And again, that doesn't make it good, but that does mean that it has, if it has stood the test of time, it's adaptive. That doesn't necessarily mean that it certainly doesn't mean that it's equally good for everyone in the population. And it may not mean that it's not actually net bad for half the population. But it has to have been net good across everyone. So I think, increasingly we in the West are insisting on a kind of cultural relativism in which we say every way of being is equal. And I think that I used to ascribe to that even as an evolutionary biologist. It felt like the sort of honorable liberal perspective. And the more I think about both what we are doing in the West with regard to encouraging women to behave like raunchy men, but also, and more obviously, and especially so, what many traditions, especially easily recognizable in Islam, do with regard to constraining their women so that men aren't allowed access to their own desires, and there are very separate domains for men and women. Those aren't ways that I want to live. They aren't, neither of those are ways that I want to have as my baseline in society. And it's actually totally okay. And, we can disagree, but for me to say, you know what, the burqa is not a feminist garment, right? This may protect women from rape, but that's taking way too much agency away from women and putting all of the responsibility on women to avoid something that men are obviously active participants in. And I think in the West, we're moving in the opposite direction way too far. So, well, maybe there's a lot more to say there, but maybe prompt me again.
Well, can I ask my question here? So I posed this question to Colin Wright when he was on the show as well. And my question is, we all, and please correct my language, I'm probably saying this all kinds of wrong, but like my understanding of sexual mating strategies is that there are signals that we put out into the world to try and indicate that we are seeking a mate. And, typically in an evolutionary sense of the opposite sex, right? And I'm very interested in this current kind of time that we're in where there are so many young people who are taking cross-sex hormones, who are having surgeries to alter their physical characteristics. And not just that, but there's an entire generation of young people whose conception of what sexual attraction means is supposedly based on gender identity. And so, who knows if by the time they're 35, they would have kind of discarded that philosophy. But I work with adolescents, and I know that many of them are what I think is pretty confused about how to read others, understand sexual signaling. Plus, then you have social media coming into the play where our three-dimensional, like pheromone exchanging interactions are dead. So I just don't know what this means for this particular generation. I don't know if it's going to have a big impact on evolution per se, but just within this generation, what do you think about this from the perspective of an evolutionary biologist?
I think we're wreaking havoc, like complete havoc. I have, as of this month, an 18 and a 20-year-old, and I think they're healthier than many because of the household they grew up in and what they were exposed to. But that includes not just sort of an evolutionary explanation for what things are, but protection from screens and exogenous drugs, including hormones in the water, from a very young age. That we were lucky, honestly, this is probably going to sound crazy, but we were lucky to live on a well until they were in their teenage years. And well water isn't contaminated with the same things that municipal water systems are, which is to say, a lot of phyto and non-phyto estrogens and other sex steroid hormones that are just being ingested by people at rates that are astounding. Add to that the insecticides and herbicides, some of which are known to cause hermaphroditism in frogs, for instance. And these things are in our water supply and have been for a while. So I think that is a big part of what is confusing people, actually.
Wow.
I think that is contributing. Add to that exactly what you said, Sasha, with regard to the 2D visual only text based communication that people are having, which presumes that we know everything about how we actually interact and how we're actually communicating, and we don't. And the ways that we smell one another are not well understood, but they are profound. Mm-hmm. And the ways that we move through rooms together, like even just detecting the way that air moves and the very unconscious things around smell and sound and sight are absolutely profound. So I started with exogenous hormones that are not voluntary, because increasingly I found myself going a little bit on a journey with regard to how I'm engaging with this trans phenomenon. When I was a professor at Evergreen, I had students who presented as trans, and a couple of them, I do honestly believe that they are actually living the best lives that they can live, presenting as the sex that they are not. And in both of those cases, they had developmental trauma so remarkable that I'm not a psychologist, but I got to know them very well. And there was trauma there, right? And there were a lot of other people who presented as trans, some of whom I sat down with because of the way Evergreen was, because of the place that I was a professor. I got to know my students very, very well. I took them to the Amazon. I took them on these extended trips on study abroad and domestic trips. And I told a few of them, no, you're not. You are a non-masculine, young man in one case. I'll, obscure some of the details here, but, you are the only son of a macho father with a bunch of sisters, and he wanted a hunter and a fisherman and, a fence builder, and you're a poet, and it's okay to be a poet, but you're still a man. Celebrate who you are, but don't pretend that you're something you're not. And that, those conversations the last ones that I was having with students were in 2015, 2016, which is both a long time ago and also, already there was a lot of trans stuff happening. They went over okay, right? Like I was able to have those conversations. And, so there's a way in which, although I'm not trained as, and I'm not a psychologist, the kinds of relationships I had with students did amount to therapeutic relationships in some cases. And then, since things have gotten even crazier, I have had the increasing sense of basically I don't buy any of this. Like it's all a farce. It's all a combination of contagion and skullduggery and in many cases men trying to get into women's spaces. And then if I go back a little bit, which I think I'm sort of sliding back into, I'm remembering the students that I knew well, who I do think are living the best lives they can live while presenting as the other sex. And in both cases, they're female to male. So it's a different situation with regard to risks to other people. They pass. Yeah. And I think about not just their developmental trauma that I know that they had, but also I wonder about what they were exposed to. And so this is why I'm now coming around to thinking about chemicals like atrazine, which, is one of these agricultural chemicals we've been spraying widely and is found in the water supply in almost all municipal water, at least in the US. And where it is, even in low amounts, it's turning frogs hermaphroditic. Why do we expect it wouldn't have any effects on humans? I don't know. Why would we expect that? So I have, I'm trying to have, actual compassion for the confusion of people. And while we, the three of us and so many beyond us are trying to fight the insanity and the vulgarity and the violence that is being perpetrated on, all of us by a movement that does not have anyone's best interest in mind, except for, I think, the active perpetrators of it.
It's amazing when you're saying all that, it does feel like it's something that we haven't explored. Myself and Sasha immediately go towards the psychological. And then we meet somebody like you and we remind ourselves we're in our own silo. We're in our own echo chamber, psychologically everything. And then you're reminded, you're right. So, they've been talking about estrogen in the water and things like that through birth control for a long time. And what could be the impact of that. And it feels obtuse to disregard it. We've never had so many chemicals, but it reminds me of one of the questions we thought about asking you, which was around feelings and instinct. And there's an intuitive feeling from an awful lot of people that anybody trans, there must be something biological or even chemicals in the water or an influx of testosterone. An awful lot of people who aren't versed in the whole psychology of it, I think they instinctively go towards that. There must be a hormonal imbalance, just like people very much fall into the chemical imbalance in the brain for depression. And I think our brains like the jigsaw of that. You know what I mean? That there's a piece and we put it in and it makes sense and we all feel the better for it. But yeah, the question between our feelings and our instincts, and you would know more about our instincts than many. And I think an awful lot of people are talking about the disgust instinct these days, and they're talking about how we have to honour it because it keeps us safe, apparently, you know, our danger instinct, our fear instinct. But it can also bring out the worst in us. That very same disgust instinct can respond really badly to perfectly okay people who are presenting in a way that we're not used to. Anyway, I'm interested in your views on any of that monologue.
Yeah. I think I tend to use the word intuition rather than instinct. But I think all of these words are relevant: feeling, intuition, instinct. And there does seem to be a bit of a disconnect, doesn't there? You know, facts, not feelings, but trust your instincts, right?
Totally.
I think it is not inconsistent to say we can have it both ways. That let's go to you invoked disgust, and I would say fear. This is actually exactly in line with the new book that I'm working on, a piece of it. Fear. I don't focus on disgust in the book, but fear and pain are both valuable and important, and we need to listen to them when we experience them, and we can be misled by them. Both of those things are true. And so to your point about the jigsaw puzzle, doesn't that fit in neatly? Now I have an explanation. Now I have a name for it. Now I have a diagnosis. Now I know what's wrong with me. Please give me the pill. Please give me the surgery. Let's fix this thing. That's not the way complex systems work. That's not the way evolutionary biology works. That's not the way humans work, right? So, we want as humans, especially in the 21st century, with so many things around us that we can't fully understand, to say, can I just get an answer for this? And then take it in and say, that's my answer. And I'm going to set it and forget and not think about it again. And so, disgust is good. Okay, good. I'll just trust my disgust. Fear is good. I'll just trust my fear. No, it can't be that simple, right? If we all think about our own experiences, we know that we have had intimations of fear sometimes and acted to protect ourselves and, hopefully successfully, and feel like, you know what? I'm glad I trusted my instincts again, right? Like, I'm glad I trusted my fear because I will never know, but I think I evaded a bad situation by crossing the street, by, not going out with that guy, with whatever it is. And sometimes we all have been fearful and had occasion to recognize, that was a miscue. And, especially as women, but I think everyone, but especially as women, I think we would prefer to make the error in one direction than the other. Mm-hmm. If we are being told, don't trust your fear, just accept these men in your spaces, actually, for women, I would say, no, we're allowed to be more careful rather than less. Absolutely. Like I would prefer to trust my fear and make the mistake of trusting it when it was not appropriate than not trusting when it was appropriate. Like which error do I want to make more? I'd rather not make any errors, but given that we know we'll make errors, I'd rather be on the side of the line that says I'm going to be more cautious and not put myself in situations where it may be dangerous. But what that all amounts to is disgust. Yes. Evolved response, useful. Can we be disgusted by things that aren't worthy of disgust? Yes. Should others be able to inform us of when we are allowed to be disgusted? No. Mm-hmm. So should other people be allowed to inform us of when we should be fearful? No. But we also need to learn from our own experiences and be willing to listen to other people. We just are in no position. No one else should be in a position to tell us, you must not be afraid of this situation. If there's something in your brain going, I don't think so, then I think that your intuition, what you have on board, if you have lived a life of exposure to things, of experience, then that's your body and your brain are telling you things about your experience that you should trust. And, when you're successful, you'll never know for sure if you needed to be careful. So it is hard to get better at it. Right. But we all do this. I've just sort of laid out like not a very clear, I think, way of doing it, but we all actually do this. And I think part of what not just the trans ideology, but many young people are looking for is a list. It's a bullet list. Like, well, tell me what to do in the situation. Like, just give me the recipe. It's like, there's no recipe. This is life. This is messy. You're a mammal. You're human. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to have to take risks. Risks are good. Risks are risky, ipso facto. And so, some bad things are likely to happen, and you set for yourself where it is that you want to set that line.
You also mentioned in that incredible kind of explanation something really key, which is you said something like, and if you've had a sufficient amount of life experience and, I think about wisdom and kind of concrete experiences on which to build that kind of pattern recognition of like something in my instinct is catching a pattern. This could be dangerous. And I'm thinking about how many kind of young people on the other side of this have had very little life experience. And due to the kinds of ideologies and belief systems that they're imbibing, especially with like the way social media algorithms work, many of them have this availability bias where like the last 20 things they read were about how cis people hate you and want you dead. And so then every interaction that they engage in feels fearful. Like they genuinely feel those emotions. And so it's so tricky because we are also susceptible to being shaped and misshapen by the kind of stuff that we ingest. And I mean, if adults can be led astray by weird beliefs, how much more vulnerable are young people that have no life experience and like they don't have that kind of sense of perspective. So it's very tricky.
It's incredibly tricky. And I mean, we are all the center of our own universe. Right. And the younger you are, the more unlikely it is that it has occurred to you that is also true for everyone else you're interacting with. And so, when you're walking down a busy street and someone hip checks you, is your reaction, what did I do to him? How dare he do that to me? Or is your reaction, oh, that was an error? Or, oh, maybe he's having a bad day. Maybe that is entirely about him. And I'm actually not a player in his game. Like, I don't have a role. Like, this was not about me for him. That was about him. And the expectation that everything that happens to you was fundamentally about you is an error. And, the thing that I have said, and I think increasingly it's less and less true for people, but is that the greatest corrective to this kind of very narrow, frankly, narcissistic, or at least not borderline, but like, approaching narcissistic thinking. Is travel. Like real travel, and not travel to resorts, not travel to places that have been made to look like your home country, but actually going someplace where, whether or not they speak your language, even more interesting if they don't, but, you don't have to go outside of your own, especially if you speak English, there's so many places, but the US and the UK and Ireland and Australia and New Zealand are all really different from one another, actually. And you go and you interact and you go, oh, not only am I not the center of the universe, my culture isn't the center of the universe. And this is a particular problem for Americans, that, Americans have this sense that our world is the world. And to some degree, citizens of all countries think that. But I think Americans have it worse than anyone else. Like we were raised on arrogance, and it produces the kind of self-absorption that we're seeing.
And could I add to that, like John Haidt's book about the anxious generation and this generation that have come up who have been taught to use their fear as a shield to stop them from doing anything they want to do. Yeah. And you particularly were an early target to that. I actually wrote about you way before I ever knew you and had anything to do with gender. I wrote about you in, I forget which book, Fragile, I think. I wrote a book about anxiety. And, you wrote a very, very erudite and considered I think it was an open letter to the students about Halloween and subversive behavior and the hysteria. And I know that's kind of a forbidden word, but this feeling of a frenzy of fear that can kind of come across, the madness of crowds. That is something that we really have to contend with these days, along online on contagions and the younger generation who've been taught to use their fear in a way that you could say they're being socialized rather than it's intuitive, but it's very powerful.
Yes, it really is. You may be thinking of Erica Christakis with regard to the Halloween letter.
Yeah.
But a year and a half later, a wholly different but remarkably similar series of events unfolded at Evergreen,
thank you
where Brett and I were.
Get me out of it.
Yeah, no worries. But really, those were the two big early events that got people's attention. And, and I did write an open letter to the faculty, that was not entirely unlike Erica Christakis' letter to the students at Yale. And it is precisely this, like, open up your minds. Do not take psychological affronts as the same way you would being attacked by a spear. For goodness sake, this is, and actually I wrote about this, for the New York Times. The part of the reason I did not know at the time why I was so set on running study abroad programs for students. And these were programs to remote parts of, Central and South America. And, I created them all myself. So I took these students into remote field stations and had taught them first about animal behavior and about risk and about statistics and, about, all of the sort of theoretical things. But I was once asked when I was proposing this by a college administrator, why can't you just read about it? I said, why can't you just read about being in the Amazon as opposed to, being in the Amazon? Because it's fundamentally different. Because just like you said earlier, Sasha, the experience, the full embodied experience of being in a place and the serendipity and the risk and the, what do I look for? What do I pay attention to? There's this giant sea of green. And yes, there is risk, but there is so much opportunity here. And sorry, reading about it or watching a movie won't do it.
I can't believe you were asked that. That is the most remarkable question. I can't even really understand how that was a question, like a legitimate, like people don't remember what it's like to physically be in a place where you're kind of scared.
I think, unfortunately, and I mean, you know this, that some number of people, and this wouldn't have been true for this administrator because she was older, but some number of people have just never been in that place.
Yes.
So no, they don't remember it because they never had it.
Yeah.
Right?
Wow.
We hope you're enjoying this conversation as much as we are. We just wanted to take a quick moment and say thank you to all of our listeners. Your support helps us to keep the lights on and the mics hot.
We recently made the switch to Substack so we could build a more robust listener community. Visit widerlenspod.com and check out the different subscription tiers.
For just $8 a month, premium subscribers get access to weekly bonus content, discussion posts, and more.
And founding members get the inside track on who's coming up on the show with the ability to submit their own questions for our esteemed guests.
For those of you who are in need of parenting support and resources, we each have parent coaching membership groups. Plus, you can buy our book, When Kids Say They're Trans.
And if you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe and get involved in the lively discourse in the comments section.
Thank you so much. Now back to the show. I remember reading this unbelievable essay you wrote about the boat flipping, and you had one of your sons or maybe two of your kids with you guys on that trip, and we'll have to include it in the notes. I mean, first of all, you're a beautiful writer, and reading about that experience, it gave me this kind of like dual experience of feeling the thrill and excitement and the deep desire to go have such a terrifying experience. And then at the same time, just so happy that I was in my bed under a bunch of comforters drinking a coffee and not experiencing such a terrifying thing. But it's amazing that you got to do these trips with your students. And I can only imagine the level of connection and bonding and sense of closeness that you and your group felt with one another after going through these really harrowing and also probably super enriching experiences. And I think that's interesting too, because I sense that young people and all of us, we deeply desire a kind of connection and a bond that feels that deep, but without the means of actually getting there kind of authentically or organically. Like all this community online and like, I'm going to stand up for my people no matter what. And I'm going to dox this other person to show solidarity for my group. I mean, it's like a pseudo attempt to get there, to get to those really life-changing bonds, I think.
It absolutely is. I remember, this is strange, but I remember as a girl, recognizing that because I was a girl, I would never go to war. And while that was obviously terrific, I was a little bit sad that it meant that I wouldn't have that set of experiences, which included the real, physical risk and tests and the bonding with the people with whom you are in it. And, that will no doubt sound incredibly naive to anyone who's been in a war or who is trained for war. And, there's a reason that we have sex segregation in some places. And, soldiers at the front is an obvious place for it. But it is a universal desire, among males and females, to want that kind of connection. And to also, I think, I hope this is universal, to want the physical tests, that to be tested physically, mentally, psychologically, to actually want to be tested so that you get stronger. And I think, men and women tend to do it differently. As children, before we go through puberty, boys and girls are very similar in terms of risk taking and in terms of, what things they'll jump off of and such. Not identical, but much more similar. And then puberty tends to send us in fairly different directions with still a lot of overlap, but somewhat different directions. And women are less likely to seek thrills and to seek risk that may result in the loss of life or limb. And some women like me really like that stuff, and we're somewhat unusual among women, but it doesn't make us any less women, right? And it doesn't mean I'm a man, right? But the tests, I think the anxious generation that you have referred to, Stella, and that Jonathan Haidt has written about, is anxious precisely because, well, one of many reasons, it has been assured, they have been assured, the generation, it is the generation, all the people in it have been assured that, anytime they're uncomfortable or sense that pain may be coming, that is the problem and they must resist it. Yeah. As opposed to embrace it. See what you can withstand. See how far you can push it until you fail. And once you've failed, now you know how far you can go, and now you know what you can shoot for, and whether or not you can fail later the next time you try this thing. Be it a physical challenge or a mental challenge or a psychological challenge. Any of these challenges, push yourself so that you can get better, but that's going to require that you fail so that you know how far you can go.
And could I come in on that? Because that's such a good point, because myself and Sasha, just like yourself, intuitively sending your students to see other cultures. When we talk a lot to parents and we talk about young people and even to young people, we talk about the value of different cultures, seeing different cultures, especially the ROGD young person. And when you look at the research, and they say the less risk taking you take in real life, the more risk taking you take online. And they've shown research. I know.
Wow.
And
Amazing.
You have a whole generation of young trans-identified women who are willing to get mastectomies and take hormones that destroy their bodies. And a lot of parents will tell me, Sasha, this kid won't take a Tylenol when she has a headache.
I know.
But she wants to undergo this heroic transformation journey. I mean, that's how it's often framed. And you see these YouTubers who are like, well, this is my 9th fallow revision. And I'm like, oh my God. It's unbelievable. And so I think the desire for those tests, the physical tests, comes out differently. Girls cut themselves. They starve themselves. They make themselves throw up. Like, it's physical
sacrifice.
tests. Yeah.
You know, the sacrificial nature of it, which, you know, if you look through history, there was very often sacrificial natures of it, which is kind of extraordinary. I had the very same urge as you did. I think you're the first person who's also said that they had it, because it's such a kind of inappropriate. Weird. Yeah. But I remember when I had my first baby thinking, oh, that's the first time I felt like I was up there, you know, and it's not the same, but it felt very animalistic. And it was the first time I thought, yeah, that was real life. That was the real deal, having a baby. So, and it's extraordinary. We seek it out. Something about I'm a body and I want to test me.
I'm a body. I'm real in this universe. And especially the more we are in front of our screens, the more we can forget that. So I do wonder, like, that's an amazing result that you just shared, Stella, about the less risk you experience in physical life, the more risk you tend to engage in online. That's extraordinary. Like, almost like it's zero-sum risk, right? But with regard to my daughter won't take a Tylenol, but she's going to get a mastectomy. I want my much more shallow investigation of this space online that I think you are both familiar with, sense is that the targets of the hormonal and surgical intervention are being assured that there is no risk.
Yeah.
Like, this is why they don't want anyone to talk about desisting, detransitioning. They don't want anyone to be talking about the grotesque surgeries, especially the bottom surgeries and, you know, the fact that they basically never succeed. Like, success is impossible. Like, it feels like maybe there is some embrace of risk there, but what it feels like is many people are convinced there's actually no risk at all.
Yeah.
This is more safetyism. In order to be my whole and complete and most organic self, I just need to do this thing, and medicine's got it figured out. And thankfully I live now when medicine has it figured out, so I'm just going to go down this path, which when of course it's precisely not that, right? It's the opposite.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I often will ask parents, and these kids are mostly pretty young, and I'll say, has your child ever had a medical problem? Like, have they ever been to the hospital? Have they ever had any kind of surgery or procedure? And it's usually no. And so there's kind of that lack of understanding of what does it mean to go under the knife? You know, even if you're having a procedure that is very, very well studied with excellent outcome rates, you know, recovery is very, very difficult. And it just reminds you, absolutely, we are mammals, we're fallible, we can break. And yeah, you're right. They are being presented with this risk-free authenticity train kind of thing.
Yeah. An authenticity train, as you say, that depending on the surgery, requires that you be a patient for life.
Yeah.
That you can never again be a free agent. You can never again be an autonomous being who can wander off into the world and explore. You always have to be under the care of someone. And I wonder too, if that's not, to me, that sounds like a nightmare. Like there's nothing I want less than to be required to constantly be under the care of someone. But given the psychology of the generation, maybe it's part of the appeal. I will always be cared for. I will always be under the care of a doctor who will be making sure that the thing that they wrought is successful.
And it feels like, you know, it's always layer upon layer when you talk about trans issues. Well, it feels like that. So it's maybe a seeking of the real experience, a kind of a seeking of a risk, but that's shrouded in safetyism, and it's complicated by sacrifice, and it's layer upon layer. And it feels like that's why it's so hard to unpick. And that's why the parents are going, I can't make head nor tail of this. It's so complicated.
Right. Like, you know, my kid never had any indications of this at all. And suddenly here we are, we're like hurtling, you know, inexplicably.
Yeah, a key point we're not saying it's about wearing trousers or anything like that. You know what I mean? This is to do with other instincts that are often not being addressed. And I think, you know, travel was so interesting, that intuitive, you leading the students to travel, and me and Sasha saying, would you consider bringing the child elsewhere? Would you consider exploring other cultures? It feels intuitively appropriate for these very cosseted young people who have one view of society. It feels very appropriate for them to see other societies, other cultures.
Other societies, other cultures, other languages, other foods, other music, all of that. But also other ways of being men and women, right?
Yeah.
Because, somehow this incredibly regressive, misogynistic, almost trad, but of course, exactly not trad, but like this throwback, this regressive throwback to gender roles that we were moving beyond really successfully, right? Okay, let's show you what things look like in other cultures and show you that, in this culture over here, yes, men and women still do live very traditional lives. Do you want that? Okay. Do you really not want that? Then, come back here and see how much freedom you have in the West. My God, do we have so much freedom?
We do.
And we don't, it is a restriction of freedom to say you need to pretend that you're the thing that you're not in order to behave the way that you see people of the opposite sex behaving.
Yeah.
That is a restriction of freedom, not an expansion of it.
It's remarkable. Yeah, because this is really pointing to how, like Stella said earlier, the playing around, the experimentation is all kind of cerebral, theoretical, and linguistic, rather than taking advantage of the physical, three-dimensional freedoms that we have. And, I think sometimes kids that we work with or parents we talk to, it seems like the kids are actually afraid of growing up. And so back to this question about the kind of medical, kind of parochialism of like, well, someone will always be taking care of me. And I just want to mention our producer kind of commented in the chat here about our questions around safety and risk. Kids are being told that it's more risky not to have the surgery because of the threat of suicide.
Oh, God, yeah.
So that's kind of another way that this relationship with risk has been perverted somehow.
So I wonder, is that working on the kids, the targets for the surgery, or more on the parents? Because and again, this is not a population that I have direct contact with. I never met any of the parents of the students who I had who thought they were trans, et cetera. But it feels like the idea of suicide becomes a weapon, is handed to people as a weapon, a threat that they can wield to their parents to get their parents to comply. And then their parents feel that, of course they do, as a terrifying risk, because isn't that the first and most enduring nightmare of any parent, right? Yeah. So that was a brilliant strategic move. Totally. Whoever came up with that.
Horrible.
But that's what it was. Right?
Yeah. Can I ask, I think it was in 2022 or 2020, you and Abigail Schreier had this beautiful letter writing exchange where you talk about a lot of this stuff. And as you said earlier in the show, you've had an evolution in the way you come to understand, like, what is gender dysphoria? What does it mean to be like really trans or not really trans? So I know you've changed your perspective on a lot of this, but you did have this kind of exchange about the role of parents and is it abusive to medically transition your child? And you just highlighted the kind of blackmail and abuse that parents are kind of on the receiving end of from gender doctors. Have you shifted your view at all on that? Or do you have a more kind of complex understanding of the role of parents in this whole thing now?
I don't remember exactly what I said in my exchange with Abigail, which I loved. But
it was basically that you do think parents have a responsibility and that you see it as child abuse to transition your child, something along those lines.
I do still see it that way, but I would perhaps say it with a little more nuance, which is that, understanding exactly as we were just talking about, that there are, with every passing week, there are more weapons that the children are being handed by the trans activists to wield in order to get their parents to do what they want. And so the parents are back on their heels. Yeah. For, some years ago, my feeling was actually the parents have no excuse. This is their children. They have absolutely no excuse. And I still feel that basically, But I would say to parents who are suffering, who were surprised by the thing. It came at them all of a sudden, and their child was miserable, and their child who had been functioning normally is now not functioning, and they are beginning maybe to cut or to, never present themselves because they're always in their room with the door closed, looking at, the parents don't know that is a position I am lucky never to have been in, and I can't fully understand what it is. But I would hold the line and say, you don't give your child puberty blockers. You don't give them cross-sex hormones. You don't let them get the surgery. None of those things are actually going to be good for your child. And, the language around that's child abuse may not be the right approach for some parents at some moments because they themselves are suffering. And if they feel like people are coming at them from all sides, they may make a wrong decision.
There's also, I think you could almost divide parents into some have been taught to follow the experts, to follow the doctor's advice, and that's their showing of their love. And some have been taught to not necessarily follow the doctor's advice. And that's almost a personality or a disposition. And if you've been brought up to kind of follow, know your place, and the doctor's telling you to do it, do it. To me, that's a whole other layer on those parents.
And I would say, this is very much a space that I've been thinking about. First, there are sex differences, typical, average sex differences between whether or not you're inclined to trust the authorities, where women are on average more compliant, more. But there's a psychological term from Big Five, agreeable. Thank you. More agreeable. Yeah, women are more agreeable. Right. And there are places where being more agreeable is a better trait to have. And there are places where being less agreeable is a better trait to have. It's not that men are better in this regard. And it's not that women are better. Right. It's context specific. And part of the reason that we have men and women with different average traits is that we work really well together. And there are different contexts where one or the other personality trait is better. And this is one where the more male typical trait is a more effective response to the societal thing that is coming at us. Do not trust the experts. They may have no idea what they're talking about, or they may be lying to you. This is not the place to trust the so-called experts.
On that subject, before we go towards, we'll be, going over towards our exclusive content soon. But I'd like to know, obviously, you came to Denver. You gave an amazing presentation. I really, really loved it. It was really, and it's been a big hit on YouTube, and I recommend listeners to check it out because it's powerful. And the Phil Lilly controversy that happened afterwards, he was, I feel I could not bring it up. This is the man who identifies as a man who also identifies as autogynephile, and was wearing a blue dress, a very elaborate blue dress, went to the men's toilets, and certainly was respectful in his behaviour, arguably, in the conference. And it caused a huge controversy some days after. It wasn't immediate. The picture went up on the Saturday, I think, and the controversy began on the Wednesday following. So it wasn't an immediate Twitter reaction, which I think is in itself quite interesting. And you took your own position on that. So could you let our listeners know about that? I don't think we landed on the same page.
Yeah, no, I don't think we did, but it's been a little while. So I had the first night at the conference, before the conference actually started, I guess the night before the conference, I was sitting talking with some women, and I saw him across the room, and I did a double take. I was like, what's going on there? I didn't expect to see a man in an elaborate dress at this conference. And the next night, after all the talks, he approached me and offered me his book, and we talked for a while, and I found him, engaging and not creepy. He didn't set off any of my, in any of my radar, nothing. But I also, so he in particular did not set off any radar for me. But let me see how I'm trying to remember exactly where I ended up. I haven't thought about him in a while. I think more than the person, I ended up, it's a thick book. I did not read the book, but I skimmed many parts of it. I ended up finding in his portrayal of what he understands to be true about autogynephilia that it is it's a paraphilia. And I'm not sure that I grant that there are important distinctions between paraphilias and kinks. And I don't grant that anyone in a public space should be forced to be exposed to other people's paraphilias or kinks. That there are societal expectations around where we do what. And we don't poop in public, and we don't display our sexual fetishes in public. Now, obviously, pooping in public is a hard line. Like, you either are or you aren't. And being on sexual display is not, right? Because at some level, we are all, we are sexual beings, and we are in public, and we, unless we're in full, burqa, basically, right? We are on display at some level.
And even the burqa arguably is signaling that that's a female. I mean, it's a biological signal as well. So sorry, keep going. Right.
No, you're absolutely right. So, we are signaling, we are communicating no matter what, if we are in public, if other people can see us. But, societally, I believe that we have come to agree that, we shouldn't be expected to receive, to be, if I read him correctly with regard to what he writes into the book, he is dressing that way so that other people will perceive him as a man in a dress, and that it is a sexual behavior for him. And I don't think he has the right to force the rest of us to be participating in his sexual paraphilia. I think I landed there and where we disagree.
I suppose I'm kind of aware that there'd be some trans women with autogynephilia, trans-identified males, their sexual paraphilia would be to come across as the kind of ordinary woman with the jeans and t-shirt. And that's their paraphilia. And on some level, that's acceptable, but a blue dress isn't. That's one point, I think, where it starts to get into a really grey area of what is, because his was so, he's a circus skills trainer, and he presents as somebody who is elaborate by nature, and they exist, these people, who do tend to wear clothes that are different. And the second thing is, and what could Jen Specht, who's running a conference, do about that? Because when we get to a point of policing clothes, where do we land? Do we say you can't wear eyeliner if you're a male, but you can if you're a female? Can you wear a silky shirt? Can you wear a silky blouse? Can you wear a skirt? Can you wear trousers? Well, it becomes so totalitarian or authoritarian so fast.
Yeah.
That
great. To the first point, I would say, if it's autogynephilia that is causing you to dress in jeans and a t-shirt, I also don't want to be forced to engage with that. Right. So in order to be consistent, I think it doesn't matter if it's a fancy blue dress or jeans and a t-shirt. If it's a paraphilia that is causing it, as opposed to, and I may be wrong, and I may change my mind on this, but my sense is, if there's developmental trauma, if you cannot engage with the world as the sex that you are, I would like there to be leeway for you to be presented to the world as something else. But if this is what is getting you off, you have to keep that private. So that is where I fall out now. With regard to what you could do, as a conference, one of my overwhelming senses, which I never put into what I wrote about it, was, I'm so glad I'm not you. I don't know. This is part of why I don't want to be running a conference. I don't know what I would have done, but one I did remember an experience that I had on a study abroad trip once. So again, this was actually in the Amazon, and I was co-teaching my final study abroad trip. I actually co-taught with my husband. And so we had our kids. It was the same trip where the boat accident happened. We had our 2 young children, and the 2 of us were professors, and we had 30 undergraduates who we knew very well because we'd already been working with them for 15 weeks or 10 or 12 weeks before we took them on this 11-week trip through Ecuador. And I had a few students, a couple of beautiful female students, who were very exhibitionist, and they had been on campus, and we had been concerned about, we had talked a lot about cultural sensitivity and, everything you would expect in advance of going. And about 3 days into a week or two of being at this one very remote field station, which was entirely staffed by local Warani, like actual local Amazonian men, where one of my students was walking around all the time in a bikini, she came up to me and said, "You need to make them stop looking at me." And she, may be shocked to this day, or maybe has forgotten it happened. But I said to her, no, you need to put on more clothes. And I can't believe I'm saying that, but you need to put on more clothes. This is inappropriate. Of course they're looking at you. And I did start with, has anyone touched you? No. Okay. No one's touched you. You're being looked at because you're walking around almost naked in a place where the cultural norm is no one does that.
Yeah.
You don't get to do that. We talked about this.
Yeah.
Right. So, that was me with one person in a situation that I had brought them to, and still it was really weird and awkward. And the idea of running a conference, I don't know. I didn't see you do anything wrong. Like there was no point where I was like, oh my God, what are they doing? But I just felt sympathy. Like the whole thing was a mess. I know.
Well, I have a lot more questions for you, Heather. This has been amazing to talk with you. So I guess we will kind of wrap up our main conversation here. And then I actually have some more questions about parenting for you in our extended conversation. So we'll be sure to include the links of all the things we talked about here. Is there anywhere else specifically you'd like? I know you're working on a new book, and of course you wrote the Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the Galaxy. Is that the name of the book, right?
To the 21st century.
21st century. Okay.
Cool. Brilliant title.
Anywhere else to send people?
I guess my Substack, Natural Selections.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Selections. Yeah.
Will do. It's great.
Yeah.
We'll do that. All right.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much, Heather.
Thank you both.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, a Wider Lens.
If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
And be sure to visit us on Substack by going to widerlenspod.com. There you can join our listener community, access bonus content and resources, plus learn about additional ways to support the show.
Our discussions are for educational purposes and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.